Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Doffney, and I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. And it is my pleasure to welcome back for the first time in digital form, Rick Geffken. And this is kind of a pre-author talk. He's going to be talking about the mysteries of the 1777 Battle of Navesink, which is something that he's actually working on a book for. So we're kind of getting a sneak preview of of all of Rick's research before being officially published. So he also has authored numerous articles on New Jersey history and presented historical papers at the New Jersey History and Historic Preservation, the New Jersey Education Association, the New Jersey Library Association, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. His latest published book is called Stories of Slavery in New Jersey, and that was published in 2021. He is part of a project called the New Jersey Slavery Records Index under the auspices of Rutgers University, and he joined the New Jersey Social Justice Reconciliation Committee to commemorate the only recorded lynching of a Black man in New Jersey. In 2023, Rick was recognized for historical contributions by the Monmouth County Historical Association and the Monmouth County Clerk for his efforts in the preservation and knowledge of Monmouth County history. So welcome, Rick. We are very, very excited to have you speak with us today. Before we jump into your presentation, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. We will be taking your questions throughout the program today. So if you have a question, submit it at any time using the Q&A or the chat feature, and Rick has graciously given me the go-ahead to interrupt him so that we can answer your questions in real time. At the end of the webinar, there will be a survey available. So if you have time, we really appreciate any and all feedback that you can give us when you complete the survey. And if you want more information about the American Revolution in Monmouth County, because this Battle of Navesink has never actually been documented in book form. So that's something that Rick is working on, and it's going to be wonderful scholarship. But if you want some more information about the American Revolution in Monmouth County, Michael Adelberg has done a fantastic work called The Revolution in Monmouth County, the Theater of Spoil and Destruction. You could check your local public library. We have copies here at the New Jersey State Library. And so as people start gearing up for the 250th commemoration, I highly encourage you to check that book out. One last thing, I just want to go over a brief overview of the Zoom dashboard. That this is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard may look a little bit different, but all the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can check your audio settings. So if you're using an external listening device like a headset or earbuds, you can check to make sure it's connected properly there. At any point during the presentation, if you have issues, there is a raise hand button here in the middle. You can click on that and that will alert me. I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to resolve any problems that you are having. And then, as I mentioned, if you do have questions, you have the Q&A, the chat buttons. You can use either of them to get in touch with us, and we'll be stopping, as I said, periodically to address all your questions. So that is everything that I have for you. So I'm going to stop my share now and turn it over to Rick.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. And we're going to share our screen here with any luck at all. And let's see. Andrew, did that come up for us?
Looks good.
Terrific. Okay. Well, again, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We're going to talk today about something that happened, almost 250 years ago. And it's had for some time particular resonance with me because I grew up and spent a lot of time in and around where this battle had happened. And until about 4 years ago, knew nothing about it, which is probably no great surprise since an awful lot of our history I've discovered as an adult has surprised me and possibly as well. So you probably know this part of the state over in Monmouth County where I live. The map shows you the area that we're going to talk about today. And you can also see a headline there. That was probably the first time I came across any information about this particular battle that we're going to talk about. So we'll jump right in. We'll give you the broad outline, and then we'll burrow down a little bit. So in February 1777, the British, who were in New York and Staten Island in this case, got word that there was something going on down here at the northern part of the Jersey Shore. and they sent the HMS Siren, a 28-gun ship, down south from a place called Corliss Ferry, actually, not too far from the Verrazano Bridge today. And on that particular British ship, they loaded up with Major Andrew Gordon's 26th Regiment of Foot, which was a Scottish regiment. And one of the great ironies of history is, after we talk about this, later on, much later on after the war, Andrew Gordon becomes the governor of the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. Just a little funny note there. Also on board that ship that day were what were called new levies, basically draftees, from under the command of a guy named Roger Morris. And as I mentioned, when they got word of something going on here in the hills of Highlands, they left a couple of days before this battle we're going to talk about to see what they could do about that. So, as I mentioned, the first indication I had of it was when someone alerted me to this New York Times article, which, of course, we can't read at this scale. But it was in February of 1896 that the author of this article, M.C. Murray Hyde, wrote a pretty in-depth account of what had happened that day in 1777. And that piqued my interest, of course, because of the map on the lower left that was included in the article. It was an area that I know very well. And I started to delve into it and found out some things that I did not know, and also have found out subsequently some things that I'm going to reveal today that maybe you don't know either. So what I noticed MC Murray Hyde did was when the first article was published, subsequently the middle of the summer that same year, the same article, or a variation of it actually, was published in what was then a very prominent magazine called the American Monthly that had an awful lot of historical articles. And I noticed some discrepancies, some differences, which I assume the author had found out later on, as we all often do as we research these topics. So I start to look at it. Here's the map, of course. And the broad outline of what happened after the British got down here was that the following things happened. As part of my research, I went to the New York Public Library where M.C. Murray Hyde's archives are, and I found the original drawing of the map that the New York Times later reproduced. And there was a couple things that bothered me about it, because it says here in the drawing that this was in the Highlands from above Long Point, and I know that area very well, so that didn't make sense to me. But here's a later map, an 1851 map, just to orient everyone this morning or this afternoon about it. So here's Sandy Hook way up here, off the map, most of it. Here's the Navesink River. This is the Shrewsbury River leading into, this is the Middletown Highlands Peninsula. This is the Rumson Fairhaven Peninsula today. But where this occurred was a place called allegedly where it allegedly occurred, Hartshorn's Cove, which is right about here on the Navesink River. Today, if you look at that, here's an aerial view, of course, Sandy Hook way here in the background. This is what locals call Hartshorn's Woods. The cove is here, and it turns out that what was then called Long Point is actually called Barley Point today. That's located on the Rumson side of the Navesink River, right about there. And so that contradicted a little bit from what the article had said, but nonetheless, nothing to worry about. What I was interested in right away was, who's this MC Murray Hyde person that's writing this article, which had an awful lot of detail. And I was as surprised as I hope you're going to be to find out that that was none other than Mary Crawford Murray Hyde, which was unusual to have a full-length historical article in the New York Times back in the end of the 19th century, written by a woman. She was born Mary Crawford Murray, and married a Dr. Hyde, Dr. Ovid Hyde. They lived in New York City. And when I looked into her background, I found out that she had done an awful lot of scholarship for a very good reason. One was that her great grandfather, James Cooper, was one of the militiamen captured at this Battle of Navesink. So she's obviously got credibility. She was also the great granddaughter of, and you can see in her name, a man called Joseph Murray, very prominent in Revolutionary War history here in Monmouth County, because he was killed a few years later by loyalists, as was fairly common in the days of what Michael Adelberg, among others, have called the Civil War in Monmouth County during the Revolution. Um, Joseph Murray was a militiaman, and like a lot of the militiamen, he served probably 6 months at a time, and he was back in June plowing his fields. Here's some sketches of his home and the fields he was plowing when he was ambushed by 3 loyalists who killed him, as you see, in June of that year. And this is very important to our local history because Poracy Park now is, as you can see, a place of remembrance, and his actual original farmhouse was reconstructed. It's been used for many years for historical events. Um, and it's a typical story in our history of how loyalists lived and worked day to day in their occupations, in this case, farming, and as they got involved in the war, suffered, in his case, certainly dire circumstances. So to get back to what actually happened, which was a disaster for the fairly new Monmouth Militia in the early days of the war, 1777. Here's the blow up of the map that accompanied the New York Times article. And the Monmouth Militia was stationed in various locations throughout our county. And first report that Mary talked about in her article, and that has subsequently come to light, is that there were 2 locations. The Monmouth Militia was stationed at Black Point, which is a part of Rumson, you might see on the map here, and also in the hills of Highlands. And what they found out was that a victualizing or a supply ship that was captured by the British and still being captained by a French captain had come ashore roughly where today, even though that says Seabright, it's about where Monmouth Beach is today. When the Monmouth Militia found out about it, they left their station in Black Point and started to strip the ship of anything they could, of course. When the British came down in the HMS Siren, first thing they did was they dropped off some of these new levies, so-called, and they retook the ship from the fleeing at that point, of course, Monmouth Militia, and they captured some of them as well. But then the other part of the group, the 26th Regiment Foot, assaulted the militia, which were stationed at, according to MC Murray Hyde, Quartermaster Richard Hartshorn's house. And that began my questioning of this, because I knew a little bit about where these folks were, which we'll talk about now. One of the things that was notable that led me to investigate this more closely was that she reports that the militia guard was a couple of 100 yards from the house, and they were surprised by the 26th Regiment of Foot early in the morning, and they fled, some of whom were captured, some of whom were killed. As I mentioned, this turned out in the long haul to be a real early disaster for the relatively newly formed Monmouth Militia in 1777. 4 of them were killed that we have documented during the battle. Another 40 or so escaped into the hills. Some of them died from wounds later on, but even more disastrously, 72 rather of these men were taken to New York as British POWs. And during that entire incident, the British only lost 1 man. So you can see, of course, the element of surprise helped them quite a bit. Now, when I began to look at this, I'll just give you a map that was drawn about a year or so after the battle. One of the things that are notable that a lot of you probably do know is that Sandy Hook, now a peninsula along the Barrier Beach at the northern part of the Jersey Shore, has over time been an island. And here in 1778, when the ocean broke through a place that was called the Gut between the mainland and Sandy Hook here itself, it was in fact an island. It was still attached to part of the mainland when this battle took place, although other inlets south of it were opened at any one time. So because this map is a little small, what I've done is I'm going to use a later map, later than the actual battle, to illustrate some of the points we're going to talk about today. So of course you can see Sandy Hook. This is the Middletown, Atlantic Highlands area. Highlands would be here today, Rumson, Fairhaven, and Seabright, Monmouth Beach, if you know our coast there. So among the things that Murray Hyde wrote was that the Tories took over the shipwreck, um, and Captain Roger Morris was the man who was commanding the new levies, and she claimed he was part of the Lewis Morris family of Passage Point. Now, in all due respect to her researches and her credibility as a researcher and historian, she got that little piece wrong, which alerted me to the fact that there may be other anomalies in this. She was talking about what happened here. Black Point had also been called Passage Point historically. And in fact, Lewis Morris, among the many Lewis Morrises in the early part of our history, his family did live there. But the Roger Morris family, which she assumed was the same, was actually a different group. His family was from Yorkshire in England, and the Lewis Morris family was from Wales originally. No big deal in and of itself. She does mention, however, that the militia was assembled at Quartermaster Richard Hartshorn's house, and I've known where that is for some time. It's now part of actually a New Jersey State Park called Portland Place, and he lived there on the inside of I should say, the north side of the Navesink River. Um, that was different from the part of the militia that took over the shipwreck that was here in Black Point. And it also, when I read her article, contradicted what General William Howe of the British had said. He claimed that a number of rebels had appeared on the heights above the Sandy Hook Lighthouse. Well, the Sandy Hook Lighthouse was up there, and this, if you know our geography, is actually a very hilly section of our coast. And there's no way that a militia stationed at Richard Hartshorn's house could have seen anything because they were in a very low area on the southern end of this peninsula. So that didn't make sense when I read that. She also says that when Gordon's troops from the 26th Regiment of Foot came in, they entered through the mouth of the Navesink River and landed at Island Beach. And those facts didn't add up either. So even though this part of Sandy Hook was obviously different back then, if the British had in fact come through the Navesink River here, this geography doesn't add up in her report. They would have had to come through here in what is the Shrewsbury River. There's Island Beach, which is now connected to the mainland. And any rebel forces on this side of the Hartshorn, what we now call Hartshorn's Woods, would have seen them and they would not have been surprised. They would have had to navigate this area to get into the Navesink River as well. So what she does mention is that they were piloted, the British, by Cornelius McLeese, who knew the shoals and channels of the Navesink River. And if they had come this way, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. So he lived over here in what is still called McLeese Creek area. And in fact, in some pictures I took when I took a kayak into the Navesink River, what I believe happened actually is they landed, came through an inlet here at the time, landed at what is called Rocky Point. And in fact, there are plenty of shoals in this river. And Cornelius McLeese was a local fisherman and a farmer, and would have been their guide through would have been a treacherous way for a group of people that didn't know where these very shallow regions of the Navesink River were. So that led me to believe that the only way they could have come down would have been this way. They would have come down outside of Sandy Hook, the British. They would have gone through a then existing inlet here, I think I showed you before, and landed here. And therefore, um, they, had they come this way, they wouldn't have surprised Richard Hartshorn's group, because this is fairly flat land here. So I thought, I think you may have the wrong Hartshorn. And I happen to know that his brother, or actually his uncle, Richard Isak Hartshorn, lived on the other side of the peninsula. And that would have given anybody in this location in the Hills of Highlands on the north section of the peninsula a nice view of all of this, as General Howe said. And the militia had actually assembled there so they could watch British shipping as it came and went from New York, inside or outside of Sandy Hook. And so that made a lot more sense geographically. And again, not to take away from her researches, there are an awful lot of hartshorns and have been over the years in this area. And I just think that there was a mix up in the names. So remarkably enough, that same year, we have charts of that area. Now, the British were pretty good about this, having been a very powerful seafaring nation. When they would sail anywhere in the world, they would have on board artists for their military and exploratory voyages who would sketch the harbor entrances. So in addition to charts and maps, they always had what looked like the areas that they were going to explore. And it turns out that in the very year this happened, so the chart and the, I would say the outline, the sketch had been probably done in 1776. We have the view of the Sandy Hook Lighthouse here. Sandy Hook almost looks like an island then. You can see a ship here and some smaller ships here in the Hills of Highlands. So this is contemporary with the battle. And when I blew this up, I'm pretty sure I can see, although it doesn't look very clear here, what I think is Isak Hartshorn's house in the hills up there, which would have been here, just opposite and actually west of Sandy Hook. Now, the history and the background of this is that Richard Hartshorn came from a place called Hathorn in England, bought up from the Lenape natives, all of Sandy Hook, and what are today what everybody here calls Hartshorn's Woods. But in fact, his name and his pronunciation was Hartshorn, because in this heraldry device, you can see hearts, or what the English called heart, deers. And so the family was actually Hartshorn. And he had bought this land that his grandsons, Richard and Isak, that we're going to talk about today, were involved in with this battle. So, as I mentioned, this was a complete disaster for the militia. They had lost 72 men to the British as POWs. They were taken to one of, but the most notorious Sugar House prison in New York. This is a list of a partial list here showing the men that had been taken. Was done after the fact. A lot of these men who were taken prisoner died in the Sugar House prison. Some were exchanged, typically the officers. Others were released after a certain amount of time. One of the interesting facts of this battle to me was that when I looked through the lists, a lot of very, very common Monmouth County family, both English and Dutch founding family names appear, as you would expect in 1777, men that were captured. And what's interesting about this list, which was put together by David Foreman, who becomes a very prominent militia and then state fighter during the Revolution, is that we don't know, outside of dates and some peripheral information, a whole lot about these folks. Mostly the representations of these POWs, again, because of the time, or what we have in local graveyards. The DAR has done a great job identifying a number of these people. So, for instance, James Morris, not related to the other Morrises I talked about, is buried locally here in the cemetery in Middletown. And that's, about all we have to represent him and a lot of these other young men at the time who were captured. Except, of course, the rich and prominent who can afford, and they're typically officers, have sometimes had their sketches done or paintings. And the other two, at least that we know of, are probably the only two that we know on the list during the battle, were Joseph Stilwell up there on the left and David Foreman himself, who was very prominent during the Revolution. Except one other person, and this to me was really kind of startling and yet informative at the same time. The only other person that we know that we have an image of who was at that battle in 1777 was this woman. And Betty Dorn was a young 16-year-old enslaved person to Esek Hartshorn during the battle. The Monmouth Militia had taken over his house because he was a Quaker and probably also a loyalist during the Revolution. And he had a number of enslaved folks, including a young woman who later on in life gets married, and her name becomes Betty Dorn. She passes through several generations of the Hartshorn family. And sometime in the early 19th century, one of the Hartshorns had someone commission a sketch of her. And it was interesting to find that of all the folks at that battle, and she was there attending to probably the wounded and feeding the militiamen before the battle. We have this sketch of this otherwise relatively common first enslaved person, and then a person who was free later on. So my search began by trying to find out where this actual property had been. And so I did a deed search of the Esek Hartshorn family. And of course, as you would suspect, the land came down from the proprietors through Richard Hartshorn to his son William, and then the sons Robert and Esek, and then et cetera, all the way down. So I had a pretty good idea of a 200-year span of deed exchanges and purchases, and I could look up these various people to see if I could locate where the house may have been during the battle. I also rely on, you may know that there are coastal surveys that begin in the early 19th century of areas up and down and even into the inland parts of our coast. And I found this 1836 survey map that has on it prominently Sandy Hook, Island Beach, and then right here, a house that says, the actual inscription says house with a prominent east chimney. And that was therefore a navigation point for people coming into this part of the world. And so it turns out that one of Essex or Esek Hartshorn's descendants had painted or sketched a house, a representation of what the house may have looked like when it was built in 1762. And in fact, it had a prominent eastern chimney in one of its additions. So that told me that if I could find out where that house had been, I was probably going to locate the site of the battle as well. I also noticed in the deed chain that the government had bought, our U.S. government had bought about the 3-acre property from a guy named, of all things, Nimrod Woodward in 1828, which is where this is the original dual lights, but where the current twin lights is on top of what is now Mount Mitchell. So I knew I was in the right vicinity, and now I wanted to narrow down my search to where the battle may have occurred. In another map of the highlands of Navesink, as you can see, again, here's Sandy Hook up here. I knew that when Esek Hartshorn died in 1795, the property went to his daughter, Elizabeth, who married a man named Tylee Williams. I could follow the deeds. And prominently Nimrod Woodward, took over the property around the early part of the 19th century and rebuilt on that original house what he called Woodward's Hotel. And he did that because right there he had, in what was then a creek in Highlands, New Jersey today, built a dock and a landing place for tourists and visitors to come down from New York to stay at his, what he called the Woodward Hotel. So I was on the right track as far as I could see then. And sure enough, right there along, and this would be today's Route 36, was where he had his hotel. Now, he sold the property a couple of years later to a guy named William Jones, who had been sheriff of New York and had spent a long time in the military. And here in a later map, I could find again where William Jones had his property, also up from what was originally called Woodward's Landing. And by this time, the original house, the Hartshorn House, had been expanded quite a lot, both by Woodward and Jones, into what began to be known as the Navesink Hotel in those years. And it became, as Highlands was becoming a tourist destination, quite a prominent spot on the hills overlooking Sandy Hook Bay. If you were there today, again, here's the Highlands, or I should say the Sandy Hook Peninsula. That creek has been, obviously filled in and is now called Snug Harbor. And right here is a place in Highlands. This is now Bay Avenue and Highlands, a place called Huddy Park, which has got its own interesting history later on in the Revolution. As I walk through in time here in an 1851 map, as Highlands becomes more popular, sure enough, I see the William Jones Navesink Hotel there, the Highlands Navesink Lighthouse, now the first iteration before the twin lights that we know today is up there. Here is Island Beach. So we're again at least in 1851, very close to where all these incidents had happened. 10 years later, in another map, a little bit more detail. Again, here's William Jones' house and all the other prominent things. So all my landmarks were lining up to try to get to the specificity of where this battle had happened. What was new to me was something I had been familiar with as a kid, was that off what is now Route 36 and on this map were these new two roads. And this turned out to be what is today Linden Avenue, which comes off Route 36. And this is Water Witch Avenue as well. And so that would have located the site of the battle and the house right there, almost at the junction of those two. And I found some old images. Here is obviously before anything was constructed, but here you have the now twin lights. This is, you can barely see the peninsula out here, the barrier beach, and then the ocean. And here's an early image of what is Linden Avenue before it was improved in Water Witch. And interestingly enough, when I grew up in this area, we referred to this part of Highlands as Water Witch. But back then, it had been called Witch Hollow, which was an interesting sidelight for me to find. Now, it had been called Witch Hollow by an older gentleman who apparently would get spooked at night. The legend has it that he would see ghosts when he was drinking, and he owned some property down in this part of the Highlands then, and he started to refer to it as Witch Hollow. Well, over time, it evolved to be called Water Witch for a couple of reasons, which I'll talk to you about. And so, again, all of this was very familiar to me, at least by legend and nomenclature when I was growing up there. Now, to the point of Water Witch, we skip ahead a century or more because, as you probably recognize this name, James Fenimore Cooper, who was born in Burlington, New Jersey, the other part of our state, he had written a book called Water Witch or Skimmer of the Seas in 1830. Very, very popular novel. And what happened was the town fathers, as Highlands was developing, saw a marketing opportunity. Uh, Cooper never came to, as far as I can determine, Highlands or even into Sandy Hook Bay. But there were so many interesting things in this book that the local folks took advantage of that for publicity. So, for instance, in the book early, he talks about seeing here, he's talking, one of his characters is talking about seeing this prominent house called Lust and Rust, which is actually just a Dutch term for pleasure and rest. And so he's talking about this famous hotel in the hills, and that looked enough like what had been up there during the early 19th century as Woodward's Hotel that a lot of people, encouraged by the publicity-seeking town fathers of Highlands, to call that, oh, he must have, Cooper must have modeled this Lust and Rust resort after Woodward's Hotel. And they had another, at least mistake or a coincidence, because they knew that Cooper had lived in Highlands, but not the Highlands that they were referring to. Cooper lived up where actually his father, uh, the town was Cooperstown, of course, where the Baseball Hall of Fame is now. But they were from the Highlands region of New York. But those coincidences were enough for the people who wanted to generate tourist interest in the Highlands, New Jersey area to start to do a couple of really nice things. And what they did was they took names from The Water Witch, the novel, and incorporated them into Highlands, New Jersey's um, geography. And so today, if you go there, you'll see Barbary, Seadrift, Water Witch Avenues, and places like that. And it took hold so much that people for a long time, and you could still read this in some early histories of the area, that people believe that in fact Cooper was writing about this area, but I don't believe he was actually. Nonetheless, to get back to where the battle might have occurred, I found this map as Highlands is starting to develop. And this is much later. You can see here it's a May 1866 map. And here is what was now called Jones Creek, but this was where Woodward's Landing was, and then Colonel Jones as well. And way up here in one of the newly developing tracks was a place called a boarding house. And so it became clear to me that that was actually the site of those consecutive hotels, if you will, or tourist destinations that had been built over Essex Hartshorn's home, his original home there. And sure enough, also on this map was Linden Avenue and Water Witch. And then this, when I was a kid, which is now Shore Drive, superimposed on this map, was a railroad track right up from, or I should say down the hill from Route 36 or to what had been then called Navesink Avenue. Incidentally, down the hill on purpose from this particular location, several years after the battle, was where a man named Joshua Huddy, a very, very local and prominent patriot militia fighter, was hanged. Uh, the reason that's important was the British, story for another time, had done that. They purposely brought him over from Sandy Hook to hang him just where they had defeated the militia 5 years before that incident. But because, as I mentioned, I had grown up there and did not know all the details of this, I had spent my summers in the 50s and 60s right there where that development was in a place called Gravelly Point. And Gravelly Point is where all of the stories concerning Joshua Huddy's hanging occurred. In fact, I used to go as a kid through Huddy Park, not knowing much more than what I had read on the monument there. And there I am in all my glory and always a fashion plate, of course. When I was a kid at Gravelly Point, which is very close to where all of these historic events had happened during the Revolution, of which I was very, very unaware as a young man. Now, as I mentioned, Lust and Rust, so-called, the hotel that so many proprietors had used for their tourist attractions over the years, actually had burned down in 1875. And here's an article from a local newspaper talking about, by then it had been called the Water Witch House, taking the name from the local geography, and also in an accompanying image to the article says the ruins of lust and rust. And the fireplaces in that 2 or 3 story hotel had stayed there for many, many years, long gone by the time I came along. And so the legend of the Battle House, the tourist hotels, and also James Fenimore Cooper's location of Lust and Rust kind of became fused. But at least for me, there were hints of where this may have happened. As a matter of fact, when this fireplace, the brickwork from the original Isak Hartshorn's house was taken apart, a local doctor had reconstructed the fireplace, and these andirons, which I believe are still, I know are still in existence, the Highland Historic Society has them in storage, probably came from the Hartshorn house that was built in the 1762. And all of the hints that I needed to find the location of the battle were lining up, including, as I mentioned before, and this house now would be facing north. This would have been the southern side of Hartshorn's Woods today. There was the addition with the eastern chimney. There was probably the original chimney to the house, which would have been over here, and then expanded, of course, over the years. So I determined through all this investigation and looking through titles and deeds and maps that if you went there today, you would be following Route 36 on the way to Sandy Hook, which is off this aerial view, of course. And the boarding house, so-called, on that earlier map would be right between today's Rogers Street and Waddell Avenue. Here is the Highlands Elementary School. And what we knew from the reports of the battle was that the British had landed on the other side of today's Hartshorn's Woods on a very cold, brisk night in February. They came up and surprised the local guard, which may have been down here at Isak Hartshorn's house. They flanked them, and as you already know, took prisoners and killed a number of folks. The folks that got away came into the hills here. This is now a very, very nice development called Monmouth Hills. And I got excited by this and went to my friend, and I'm sure a lot of you know Rich Veit, the archaeologist and now provost at Monmouth University, and said to him, we may have an archaeological opportunity here. Except when we looked closer, a couple of things occurred. This here is Kavusian Field today. It's a softball field that I used to play on as a kid, and it's still in existence. And it turned out that when it was built in the after World War II, they had leveled all of this part of what had probably been at least part of the battle as the British surrounded the militia locations at the house. And also this part here, if they had come up this way, this is all developed as well. So there'd be very little left to discover remnants of what had been a short but significant battle for the British and a disaster, as I mentioned, for the Monmouth Militia. Today, not a trace of where this occurred remains. There are condominiums, as you can see, built along Rogers Avenue, and any construction or destruction of the original hotel is long gone, and so there would be no chance, I don't think, for anyone to find anything left there. But I'm fairly sure, and I've talked to a lot of the folks in Highlands and the Daughters of the American Revolution folks, and they were all happy to find this location. I'm on part of a committee with the DAR in Highlands. We're going to put up a plaque this summer, probably here at the corner of the Highlands Elementary School property, to commemorate the battle in 1777. Little known, but consequential for this reason. When the British came in and destroyed this Monmouth militia, it gave them the false, as it turned out, confidence that this little rebellion that had started here in the colonies was going to be easy to defeat because of what they had done to this local militia. Instead, of course, it turned out quite differently. The militia reassembled, retrained. Of course, George Washington plays a prominent role throughout New Jersey history, as you know, during the Revolution, and things turn out to our best interest quite differently. And there's going to be an awful lot about this in the during the 250th anniversary, starting probably next fall and next year. And I'm happy to tell you that I am publishing a book that will come out from the History Press in the fall. Will include the story of the Battle of the Navesink in 1777. It will certainly talk about Joshua Huddy and his involvement and some incidents and battles he fought with Colonel Ty, who was a runaway enslaved man who wound up working for the British because they had promised him and other runaway slaves that they would be granted their freedom as soon as the war was over. And in the middle of this image, you will be happy, I think, and surprised to learn that as a result of Joshua Huddy's hanging and a retribution of a British young captain that George Washington was going to hang, Marie Antoinette, of all people, gets involved and saves the young man's life and becomes very much a part of our local history here in Monmouth County, New Jersey, and of course, the Revolutionary War. And it is, I think, a pretty fascinating story. So that book will come out sometime in the fall. And now, Andrew, they've been so far a pretty quiet group. I will entertain any questions or comments from anyone. I'm looking forward to what people might want to ask or say about this.
All right, thank you so much, Rick. If anybody does have questions, please feel free to send them this to us using the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them. Has anyone ever found anything historical of the battle or the Revolutionary War era over the years, either via construction or by a homeowner in these locales?
Not to, that's a great question. Aside from those andirons that I talked about, that the Highlands Historical Society and I believe are part of the original Hartshorn House, not to my knowledge. Now, you know how these things happen. People find things over the years, they don't know what they are. They get lost or they become fairly heirlooms, who knows? But at least the Highlands Historic Society, the Monmouth County Historic Association, nor anyone that I know has ever said that they have located, musket balls or anything like that that might have happened during this. But keep in mind, one of the reasons for that was this was a complete rout of the Monmouth Militia. And they were so surprised that I don't think there was an awful lot left there other than the house itself. This battle probably was took place and was over in 20 minutes, a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour at the most, because of the complete surprise. So I don't know that there would be a lot left in any event. Uh, Anybody on this call or this presentation who knew about anything, I'd be really excited to hear about that, as I'm sure many other people would too.
Has anyone done metal detecting or ground penetrating radar in the area?
Not that I know of. Again, because of the building, even when I was a kid, I used to walk by those places. Had no idea that that had happened there in 1777, of course. But as I would walk those streets to get up to the ball field, for instance, there were houses later on replaced by the condominium picture I showed you. And I never heard or ever read in my researches that anyone had ever done certainly any ground penetrating radar or metal detecting. But again, who knows? I often believe that, always believe that people have things in their attic and that have been passed down that they don't recognize as historically important.
Um, was there any indication of what the militia was able to take off of the ship that was scuttled? Or not scuttled,
No,
but
I haven't seen that. My guess is they were more interested in foodstuffs and those kinds of things. Everybody, and as later, as you know, and as most people know, Monmouth County and most of New Jersey becomes part of a foraging war where both sides are, taking what they can. So anytime there was a shipwreck or anything like that, battle, or a farm that had provisions, the militia or conversely, the loyalists of the British would raid and take what they could. And they were interested in cattle, farm stores, obviously grain, food of any kind. So because this was a provisioning ship, my assumption is it was mostly food. If there was any armaments, I've never seen any reports of that, nor have I seen any inventory of what they took. Um, but I think they were only able to scavenge and salvage, a couple of days worth of materials before the British came in. So I don't think that there was anything major.
what was the size of the Monmouth militia, and was this a normal size compared to other militia units?
So really, really interesting. And Larry Kidder has done an awful lot of great work on militia. He knows quite a bit more than I do. But when I heard him speak about it, he talks about how the militias got better trained over time. At this early part of the war, we're in the early months of January and February of 77. The Monmouth Militia was, I use the word ragtag group of farmers who were coming in and out of service for maybe up to 6 months or less because their livelihood depended on them going back to their farms, plowing, seeding, harvesting, whatever. And so probably there were, I don't know, if I had to guess, 100, 120 maybe men coming in and out of that location. They were camping there. I don't, you wouldn't get that many, even if it was 175 people. You wouldn't get them living in a house, a one-floor rudimentary house that was built, in 1762. But they were living, camping out around that area, probably in shifts, so that they would come in and who knows, a dozen or two would take their turns monitoring what was going on in Sandy Hook Harbor, getting that information to their superiors so they could report that up. Um, Probably at the time of the battle, based on 40, uh, people ran away and another 70 captured, 4 killed. And we added up and it's 125 or so men that were stationed there. And that may have been a result of them hearing and watching um, the British come in and take over that shipwreck earlier in the month so that they may have beefed up the forces up there on the heights of the Highlands when the battle took place. But again, the vast majority of them were captured. And I believe that of the 40 that we know that were reported as had run away from the battle, um, who knows? A dozen or more probably perished in the hills and were either buried by local folks or um, just were left during that winter to deteriorate where they fell.
Um, I know you mentioned that this was recorded in Howe's notes. Any other historical records that specifically talk about this event?
And that's a really good question, Andrew. And I was surprised that I wasn't able to find anything. And that doesn't mean there aren't. There you would assume be after action reports from the British about this devastation that they had laid into the Monmouth militia. But I haven't been able to find that, and maybe I just haven't looked in the right places yet. But I have to assume that these folks, when they got back on the ship and took these prisoners to New York, made after action reports that if I had to guess, they're either in our Library of Congress where I haven't found them, or maybe in the British Library or their archives over on the other side of the ocean. Um, but at least from the reports I have read, the British were pretty happy about what had happened. They thought, of course, capturing all these men, that they had put a pretty significant dent into the folks in Monmouth's ability to defend themselves. I'll keep looking until I can find that significant report.
Do you have an estimate of the population of the Highlands at that time?
Not a whole lot. I don't, but so if I had a guess, because it's very, very early, um, you know, certainly less than 100, and that's just an uneducated, off the top of my head guess. There wasn't a lot going on there. The Hartshorn family owned it. Okay. Oh, by the way, I should mention that um, most folks call it Hartshorn down here, but they own that entire peninsula and Sandy Hook. And in fact, because Isak and his brother uh, Robert on the other side, and Richard was their cousin, the quartermaster was a cousin. Um, they were loyalists and Quakers, but they also, we know, were very invested in kind of subtly helping the British where they could. They also, after the war, and I have this record, they went to, by document, they petitioned Parliament to refund them money for what the British had done to their Sandy Hook timbers, cedar woods on Sandy Hook during the war. And they were given some compensation for that. Um, as Michael Adberg likes to call folks like this, they were trimmers. You know, they probably played one side against the other when it was to their advantage. Although I think that because they were loyalists at heart, I think that probably Isak Hartshorn's house was taken over by the militia during the battle, or obviously right before, against his will. And because he was a Quaker, he could claim not to take part in any of the battles that happened there subsequently. As we talked about, he lived till 1795, and they kept the Hartshorn family that property for many, many years. Long soliloquy to tell you that there were very few people other than their family living in and around the Highlands during the years of the battle.
Did all the British leave the area entirely with the POWs and go back to New York City, or did they leave a British contingent at Monmouth?
You know, I would guess, I think that's another great point, Andrew. It looks to me like the vast majority of them got back on the Siren and went back up to New York with these people in prison. But it would make sense that you would leave some guards there or some forces for a while, to make sure nobody comes back, and also to, you know, prevent anybody else from coming up and spying on them subsequently. Although Colonel, later General David Foreman, did use a lot of the militia folks up and down the coast to spy on the British. I haven't seen any definitive numbers of folks that were left there. I would guess that they probably left some people temporarily, and those people would then go over to Sandy Hook that the British kept during the vast majority of the war years. Um, but that would make perfect sense if they would do that for a while at least.
Yeah, and just piggybacking on that, uh, roving contingents of the New Jersey Volunteers, a loyalist provincial unit, were stationed at Sandy Hook throughout the throughout the war.
And some other folks too,
Yeah.
yes. So as I mentioned, with this story of Colonel Ty, that's quite famous these days, I think. There were what were called refugees. When when the British formally left Monmouth County, if you will, with any troops, they had an awful lot, like the Hartshorns, they had a lot of loyalist followers that still believed that this rebellion was doomed to failure and was illegal anyway. And so you had, as Michael Adelberg and others have said, a civil war between families and neighbors throughout Monmouth County during the war years. And so if you were a prominent loyalist, and certainly right around the same time, a lot of them fled and became what they call refugees from their own homes to live under the British protection on Sandy Hook. And they were obviously white loyalists. And then the runaway enslaved folks who worked for the British, both men and women, were out at Sandy Hook. And people like Colonel Ty and what becomes known as the Black Brigade do raids into Monmouth County all the time on foraging expeditions and raids against prominent rebel folks like Joshua Huddy. Um, and so there were people scattered all over Monmouth County, as they were in New Jersey, that were loyalists, Tories. There were rebels, what we now call patriots, or what they would call themselves Whigs, WHIGS, um, and this complete mix of people working for both sides sometimes, trying to sell uh, goods to whomever they could to keep their own families going. So it's a really, really interesting period in our history, quite different than the stories I learned growing up, and most of us learned about the war. It was certainly a lot more in Monmouth County than, you know, Washington's Continental troops facing off against British troops, which of course did happen at the Battle of Monmouth. But it was a lot of the skirmishes and smaller actions throughout the Revolutionary War that determined to a large extent the outcome. So I think we're on time. Andrew, any other questions or comments from any folks?
No, I haven't seen anything come in yet. So anything you want to close with as we wrap up?
Well, just to thank you and the New Jersey State Library and continued success. And as always, for those still on, I love our state library, our state archives, wonderful, wonderful documents in the archives still to be discovered. Andrew, thank you for all what you and your staff do for us, and appreciate all your efforts to enlighten all of us into our very, very important history. So thank you very much again.
Right. And thank you, Rick, for coming back and speaking. We look forward to your new book and would love to invite you back to talk about some of the stories that you're going to be talking in there. So,
That'd be great. Look forward to it. All
all
right.
right.
Thank you,
And
everyone. And Andrew, we'll see you soon. Thank you.
all right. Sounds great. And everybody be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Bye bye.